Today on Blue 58, the Packers' new scheme could bring a lot more attention to their defensive line. Is that group up for the challenge?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I'm happy to be with you here for another episode. We're going to talk defensive line today as we continue through our preview process, but some big moves in Green Bay prior to that. First and foremost, there's going to be a new Packers president, and it's going to be Ed Policy. And if you are surprised by this, you have not been paying attention. We've mentioned this a few times on this podcast about the Packers positioning Policy to be their next president. There's a bunch of P words for you. But Policy's been with the Packers since 2012, and I think the move has been obvious that he was going to be Mark Murphy's successor since 2020, 2021. The last time that Brian Gutekunst and Matt LaFleur signed their contract extensions, they went out of their way to thank Ed Policy in their public remarks. I think that was your final indication that he was going to be the next guy. He's been a power broker in Green Bay for some time. I can't speak to the idea one way or another if he's going to be a good president. A lot of people don't like Mark Murphy. I think Mark Murphy's done a great job. I think Mark Murphy is probably headed for the Pro Football Hall of Fame someday. I will say Policy certainly seems to have been very involved with the Packers' business aspect, which might be good, can't hurt. However, seems like it's probably a good thing to do if you're going to be the next president of the Packers. However, and this has nothing to do with Policy himself, as far as the Packers as an organization go, I am annoyed and amused by the extent to which they are going to pretend like this wasn't always going to be where we ended up. From the official Packers news release announcing Policy as the next president, they described their process thusly, quote, "The search committee worked through a list of more than 90 prospects, applicants, and referrals with a number of high-quality candidates considered from across the NFL, sports, business, and entertainment. The committee that then conducted virtual and in-person interviews in June, which led to the recommendation of Policy." Then a little bit further information from PackersNews.com. Quote, "The Packers engaged management consulting firm Korn Ferry, headquartered in Los Angeles, to help find candidates. The team said more than 90 candidates were considered. Interviews with finalists were held in early June. Jed Hughes, who led the Korn Ferry team, was involved with another firm in the search that found Murphy, then the athletic director at Northwestern University. Murphy was elected Packers president and CEO at the end of 2007. The team said it followed NFL guidelines for hiring executives, which includes considering a diverse range of candidates. It did not identify other candidates," end quote. So, this is all keeping up appearances, right? You hire a management consulting firm, you interview 90 candidates, or consider 90 candidates. They didn't say they interviewed 90 candidates, but you consider 90 candidates, and then the guy you land on is the guy who's been there for 12 years, whose dad was an NFL power broker for a long time with one of the NFL's other premier franchises, the San Francisco 49ers. Okay. How real was this search anyway? I wish we could just be honest with each other is what I'm landing on here. Don't know if you're a big fan of the Hunger Games series. I wouldn't call myself a big fan, but I've at least read the books and seen the movies. But there's a scene in there that has stuck with me. The main antagonist, Donald Sutherland, rest in peace, is not really even a character in that. He's just Donald Sutherland. But he's talking to Jennifer Lawrence. And he says, "Look, I know that you and I are adversaries. We can be adversaries. That's fine. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. You're going to do what you're going to do. But if we're going to talk to each other, can we at least not lie to each other about our intentions? You can do whatever you want, be as nefarious as you want. I'm going to be as nefarious as I want. But let's not pretend that we're doing anything other than being nefarious here." And I'm not saying the Packers are being nefarious. I'm not even saying the Hunger Games is a particularly good example. But can we just have the Packers and everyone in the NFL, for that matter, understand that we know what they're doing? You don't have to lie to us. If you want Ed Policy to be the president, just don't pretend that you wanted anybody else to be the president. Don't have this report come out that there was this other guy from Washington who was a finalist for the job. There were no other real finalists for this job. This is who the Packers wanted, and that's been clear for some time. Let's just not pretend that it was anything else than that. Let's do away with that. Same thing goes for, a broader example, the Dallas Cowboys hiring Mike McCarthy a couple of years ago. It was clear that's who they wanted from the start. Just let's not do this dance. And I know that the NFL wants you to bring in other candidates, but really, how realistic is that? Is that really going to change things? How often has that happened where a team is like, well, we weren't going to hire this guy, we wanted this other guy, but then this guy that we weren't interested in at all really changed our minds? I just don't think it happens. So let's at least try to not pretend. Ed Policy was always going to be the guy, and now he is the guy, and that's where we are right now. The Packers also have a new kicker. They claimed James Turner off waivers from the Detroit Lions after the Lions, signed Jake Bates, who was recently in the UFL. The Packers apparently were also interested in Bates, so it's kind of amusing that the Packers ended up with the guy that the Lions cut because they got Bates. Now, Turner, in a vacuum, is a pretty interesting candidate. He spent 4 years with Louisville, then 1 year with Michigan. Second team All-Big Ten last year as a part of Michigan's national championship run. Made 65 of 80 field goals at Louisville and then 18 of 21 at Michigan. If you put any stock in the beast from Dane Brugler, he was ranked the 9th of the 10 kickers that Brugler evaluated for the beast this spring. That is noteworthy, and we'll put a pin in that just for a second here. As far as what this means as a move, probably not much, but I think it is interesting on two different fronts. First, they are still going with this 3-kicker competition. Jack Podlesny got released, I lost track of time this summer, recently, last week, I think, and I thought that was going to be it. I thought the Packers were going to be down to 2 kickers heading into training camp, but no, they want to go in with 3, and this guy on the second front is noteworthy that this is the pick. This guy is a potentially interesting kicking prospect. A decorated rookie is a much more interesting selection versus, not to throw dirt on Jack Podlesny, but he's a lot more interesting than a guy like Jack Podlesny or any other low-level kicker who has, pun very much intended, kicked around for a while in the NFL. This is a new face, a guy who's been successful in college and was a well thought of kicker heading into the draft this spring. And it's interesting that the Packers have followed this process on another position on special teams as well, signing Peter Bowden, the top-rated long snapper in this year's draft, according to, again, Dane Brugler. So it is just interesting that the Packers are bringing in some young, highly regarded talent in their special teams competitions, and that's the direction that they're going. And Daniel Whelan still faces no competition at all. Everybody else, we're going in, it's going to be Lord of the Flies with kickers and long snappers. But Daniel Whelan, free and easy. Just put down the snaps. When they snap them to you, make sure the laces are out and kick some good punts, and you're golden. Nobody is coming breathing down your neck as you try to do your job this summer. Good job, Daniel. Let's talk defensive line, but before we do that, I want to mention our Patreon and our Substack again, patreon.com/thepowersweep and thepowersweep.substack.com for all of your bonus content needs. We've had a couple weeks off here in the middle of the summer, or not really in the middle, at the beginning of the summer, as we just tried to get a couple things behind the scenes sorted out. And behind the scenes, I mean, I've been doing a bunch of yard work as I had some time off last week, but we are kicking up our bonus content offerings again. Starting this Friday with a look at the Carolina Panthers. How would we fix that team and get them back to contender status from where they were and not all that too distant of the past? They were, early, mid-20 teens. They were in the Super Bowl. How do we get them back to that level? What do you have to do to right the ship in Carolina? That's a process we're going to be working through starting this Friday. And if you want to enjoy some of that bonus content and get some additional benefits as well, head over to patreon.com/thepowersweep or thepowersweep.substack.com and join up there. So defensive line. I feel both good about this position and uncertain about this position at the same time. I think there is some interesting talent on the defensive line in Green Bay. You've kind of got 3 different levels of interesting talent, too, represented mainly in 3 different guys. First, you've got Kenny Clark, the old guard here, who has been as good a Packer over the last 8 years since he arrived in Green Bay in 2016 as anybody. He's a highly decorated defensive lineman for good reason. Then you've got the young up-and-comer in Devontae Wyatt, who I guess got his first taste of something resembling greatness last year, had a promising second year in the NFL, certainly miles ahead of where he was as a rookie. And then you've got Carl Brooks kind of at that third level where it looks interesting. You're not quite sure what he is yet, but if he can grow from where he was as a rookie, you might have some interesting pieces here. But the pieces we know. The pieces are Kenny Clark, Devonte Wyatt, Carl Brooks, TJ Slaton. You can go on and on and on. And we know those pieces pretty well. But the uncertainty comes from not knowing how they're going to fit together. I think it is fair to say that there's going to be more attention on the defensive line this year than there was last year in the recent past, just because if you talk about maybe not the difference between the schemes themselves, because everybody's kind of running the same sort of stuff, the nickel base defense that everybody's in now. But the philosophical difference between Joe Barry and Jeff Hafley is where I think the defensive line is going to get some additional attention here. Hafley wants aggressive penetration from his defensive linemen. That's what he's gone on record saying. He wants them to get upfield and attack. And that stands in some contrast to Joe Barry coming from more of that 3-4 scheme background where your defensive linemen basically are there to stand their ground and hold their ground and let the guys behind them make their plays. That didn't always work that way for Joe Barry, and I think this is where you see that he's not really a true 3-4 aficionado. He's got more professional background with guys like Rod Marinelli and things like that, where you do play that really gap penetrating sort of scheme. And Marinelli is a legendary defensive line coach, did a lot of great things with the Dallas Cowboys over the years. But that is more the scheme that he comes from and has played before. And early in his tenure, that's what he said he wanted from the defensive line. And even, from an evidence-based perspective, Kenny Clark had some good years under Joe Barry too. And I think Kenny Clark's going to have good years under just about anybody, but doing more of the Joe Barry stuff, Kenny Clark had some good years. And I don't think we can put that entirely aside. But all that to say, we don't really know what the defensive line is going to be like and operate like until we see it on the field, and that's where that uncertainty comes in. But we can clear up some of that uncertainty by reviewing some of these guys and how they shake out on the roster in some detail here. Before we get to that, just a reminder, we are going to continue to make a distinction between edge rushers and defensive linemen. The Packers on their official roster now call everybody defensive linemen. That's fine. That is accurate to do, but we want to, when we're talking about defensive linemen here, we are talking about interior defensive linemen versus edge rushers. And I think we're at the point in football discourse where everybody really understands the difference there. Rashawn Gary has a different job than Kenny Clark and Devonte Wyatt. If you don't understand that, figure it out. I mean, you got to get on board with where the discussion is at this point. He's rushing, Kenny Clark is rushing up the middle. He's taking on guards and centers. Rashawn Gary is rushing from the outside, working against tackles and tight ends. And speed and power versus power and strength. And that is the quickest difference that we can make here. But we're going to continue to talk about defensive linemen and edge rushers. We'll do edge rushers next time we get back to the defensive discussion. But we're going to continue to do that even if the Packers don't do it themselves. Also, I've decided that going forward, we're not going to do any predictions for guys who fall into our no expectations category. So a lot of your undrafted free agents who really don't look like they have much of a shot at all, we're just going to dump them in that no expectations pile and say, we'll see you next year if you are still here. And chances are they aren't going to be here in the future. So that said, as a reminder, we group our guys into 4 different buckets: no expectations, low expectations, moderate, and high. I want to talk through each of these guys individually, set those expectations, talk about what they can do to meet them, and then make some predictions for all of these guys except for the no expectations categories guys. In terms of guys for whom we have no expectations, 2 guys as of right now: James Esther and Spencer Wege, or Wege, depending on what pronunciation he's giving you on a given day. Esther, smallish, 3 technique sort of defensive lineman, not overly productive in college. We described him in our undrafted free agent roundup as Colby Wooden, but ahead of the curve. He's ahead of where Wooden is in that transition from being more of an outside rusher to being an inside rusher, still a little bit on the smaller side, but not too shabby. But being a Colby Wooden type player is probably his path to the roster if there is one. Wege, meanwhile, is out of North Dakota State, was a teammate with Christian Watson, pretty good athlete, spent a little bit of time with the 49ers, Not sure about how he fits in with this defensive line group, but he is a big guy, 6'5", 295 or thereabouts. So if he plays more of a traditional defensive end role, that would be pretty big for that. We'll see how the Packers end up using him this summer if he makes a significant impression at all. For our low expectations camp, we start with Jonathan Ford, a 2022 7th-round pick who still has yet to appear in a game. Remains more of a concept than a player at this point, but he is big, 6'5" and 338 pounds. But for him, we do have to have some low expectations because he really hasn't shown anything so far as he's been around in Green Bay. Not for nothing, he has stuck around, but again, he hasn't shown much, hasn't had an opportunity to show anything in a game, and I'm not really sure about his fit with this version of the Packers' defensive line either. Typically, the defensive line is a little bit lighter and faster in this kind of scheme than what the Packers have tended to under Mike Pettin and Joe Barry. If a guy like Jonathan Ford is going to stick around, he might have to play a little bit differently than he has in the past, which might not work for him, which might work for him, it might not work for him. It's going to be interesting to see. So he really just has to make the roster to meet expectations this year. If he ends up on the 53, there's a chance that he'll be able to make some noise, make some things happen. But I think if he can make the roster, that will show that he is headed in the right direction and will hopefully then appear in a game at some point this year. I'm not going to go far as predicting that, but I think he will be around in some form in 2024. Maybe he ends up in the practice squad just for some defensive line depth again. Familiarity is never a bad thing until a team just gets too familiar with you and says, yes, thank you, we've seen all we need to see. But we'll see whether Ford is at that point this year. Colby Wooden is next up for us. Tough rookie year for Wooden. A little bit of a weird scheme fit. He was kind of a hybrid edge rusher defensive lineman in college, and then he moved almost exclusively inside as a pro and was just, frankly, too small. He played at mid-270s weight-wise. It just wasn't big enough to play where the Packers wanted him to play at the NFL level. Supposedly he has now gained weight. It is around 290 or so. We'll see. Everybody says they're in the best shape of their life, but whether or not that is true for Wooden remains to be seen. As such, we kind of have low expectations for him coming off a bit of a rough rookie year. But I think, look, he's an interesting player. I can't let go of the idea of what the Packers see in Wooden here, because if you squint, you can see it. You can see the guy that, well, look at it this way. At mid-270s, if he's going to play on the edge in college, that makes him a really big edge rusher. If it doesn't matter the scheme you're playing in, if you're playing at 270, 275, you're a pretty big edge in college. That was Rashawn Gary. He was in the 280s when he played at Michigan, low 280s. You can find roster listings for him as a Wolverine, I think as high as 283. That's pretty big for the position he was playing, even as a traditional, hand-on-the-ground defensive end. Rushing the passer at that weight makes you pretty big in college. Wooden kind of fits that mold very roughly. And if you want him to go a different direction than Rashawn Gary did and not play on the edge, he had to gain weight. He just didn't last year. He was not big enough to play inside, and as a result, struggled. He had the second worst pressure rate on the team. He had the worst pressure rate in true pass sets of anybody on the team. Honestly, yes, even lower than a guy like TJ Slaton, whose job has never been to rush the passer. Hanging around with Slaton in terms of your pass rush numbers is not where you want to be as a pass rusher. So how can he meet expectations then? I think he's got to take a step forward from where he was last year. Prediction-wise, I'm going to say basically he'll be about the same. He's going to have a pressure rate under 8.5%, which was slightly higher than where he was last year, just over 8% in terms of pressure rate. And then his true pass set pressure rate will be under 8%. Basically, I don't think he's going to be taking a step forward. I just need to see it first before I believe in it. I understand, I think, what the Packers are trying to do. I just don't think that it's going to end up working. We're now in our moderate expectations group. We've got two guys here. The first is Carl Brooks. Exciting young player, honestly. He played outside in college, which he probably should have, or he probably should have been inside even at his weight in college, but he was effective. His college highlights are both crazy and hilarious. I referred to him a couple times as the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man because wearing a lot of the all-white alternates that Bowling Green had, he looked like just a big angry marshmallow rushing on the outside because he's a little bit rounder than you typically see from the long, angular edge rushers when he was a member of Bowling Green. But like Wooden, he kicked inside here at the NFL level and was fairly effective last year too. Lucas Van Ness ended up finishing the year with some pretty good pressure rate stats, and Brooks beat him on all the pass rush stats last year. That's pretty good performance for a rookie day 3 defensive line pick. Expectations, though, are fairly moderate for me. He's a rotational guy, for better and for worse. For better, like he's a pretty good guy to have in your rotation as a kind of back-end guy. For worse, you still are just the back-end guy there. He's probably not going to be taking snaps from Devontae Wyatt. He certainly won't be taking snaps from Kenny Clark. And he has a very different skill set than TJ Slaton. So in situations where you need Slaton, you're going to put Slaton out there. And in your standard situations, you're going to have Clark and Wyatt out there as often as you can. So that diminishes the role for Brooks. But he meets expectations then as just being that really solid rotational guy like he was last year. I'll predict that he has 4 or fewer sacks again this year, which would put him right in line or maybe worse than he was last year. Sacks are kind of like touchdowns. They can come and go, and it's not necessarily an indictment or solid evidence of how you're performing, though you'd much rather have them than not have them. But I also predict his production ratio is going to be up from the .636 number where it was last year, which would mean that he would be doing a little bit more against the run than he was a season ago, which feels like to me it tracks with some rookie progression from where you were as a rookie. TJ Slaton, next up. He is exactly what it says on the tin. Coming out of Florida, you expected him to be a big run-stuffing guy. Since he has arrived in Green Bay, when he's been on the field, he's generally been the big run-stuffing guy. He led the Packers in stops last year. He's now facing some questions of how he fits with the new defense. Fair, nothing he can control. But when you've asked him to do the things that are within his skill set, he's been very good at them. I put him in the moderate expectations camp because I think he can do the job that he's good at, but he just isn't one of the big guns for the defense overall, and it remains to be seen what kind of role he's ultimately going to have with the Packers in 2023. So meeting expectations for him comes down to finding a fit in the new scheme and then growing into that new role, whatever that new role ends up being for TJ Slaton. I think he's going to make the 53-man roster. I don't think the Packers are going to trade or cut him. They've got plenty of cap space to do what they need to do. And I just don't think it makes a lot of sense to move on from him given what he's given you. I also think he's going to get his second career sack this year. Just feels like a fun prediction more than anything that you have super hard evidence for. I also think he's going to have a new career high in tackles for loss. Each of the last 2 years, he's had 2 tackles for loss. I think he gets at least 3 this year when he's in Green Bay, and I think he is going to be in Green Bay. Finally, our high expectations group starts with Devontae Wyatt. He is headed quite firmly into put up or shut up territory. He was good last year, and there have been flashes in general, but consistency really hasn't been there yet for Devontae Wyatt. As he heads into his 3rd season, we're starting to look at the Packers needing to make a decision on his 5th-year option, which they'll have to do next offseason. And what he does this year will probably be the determining factor there. Kind of a good example of what we're talking about in terms of consistency from Wyatt is our contact pressure rate. We talked about this earlier this offseason. Talked about the rate at which he makes contact in his pressures on the quarterback. It's low. It's one of the lower ones on the team. He does get to the quarterback. He does affect the quarterback, but he does not make a major effect on the quarterback as often as other Packers pass rushers. And he needs to change that, and there's good reason to think that he will based on our earlier research this offseason. It's if you could rush the passer, chances are your numbers are going to be better than what we've seen from Wyatt. I think he can rush the passer, and I think he's going to do well in this new scheme with Jeff Hafley. So consequently, expectations are high. He needs to have a good year. The Packers need him to have a good year. And if the Packers want to play a more aggressive, penetrating style up front, he is just about perfectly suited to that. And I think it's going to lead to a good year for him. So meeting expectations, means being the first-round pick version of Devontae Wyatt that the Packers have always wanted him to be. He's got to play up to his potential, and I think he will. I think there's a big season in the works for Devontae Wyatt here. His pressure rate, prediction-wise, is going to be at or above 12.97%. That's where he was last year. It's a pretty high pressure rate, but I think he can do it again. I also think he'll have 5 or more sacks. That would be at or above where he was last year, and then 10 or more tackles for loss, which would be more than where he was last year too. He had 6 tackles for loss last season, and his production ratio will consequently, we got there, be higher than 0.7, which is about where it was last year. He was a little bit lower than that, in fact, closer to 0.6 than 0.7, but I think he will be higher than that this year. Finally, Kenny Clark. Emblematic in some ways of the fact that once you get to a certain level of expectations on the roster, you really don't need to say anything about a guy. Kenny Clark needs no introduction. He's one of the best Packers defensive linemen we've seen in a long time. I think probably the best in the 21st century, though Mike Daniels' very best seasons might be in the conversation there, so hard to say for sure, but high expectations. Of course, they're going to be high for Kenny Clark. He is the essential man on the Packers defensive line. He is the one who has to be good, or this unit is going to be in real trouble, and he's the one defensive lineman I think you could reasonably count on to have a great season. I think Devontae Wyatt is capable of getting to a great statistical season. I'm talking like Pro Bowl or All-Pro level. But if you had to bet on somebody, it would be Kenny Clark, and you'd be foolish to bet on anybody else. He's been that good, and he can be that good again this year. And I think there's reason to believe he can be that kind of guy for years to come yet. So how does he meet expectations? Just be what we expect from Kenny Clark. You expect Kenny Clark to out-and-out dominate a couple games a year, usually against the Minnesota Vikings. We expect that. We expect him to have a good season, to fit in with another defensive coordinator, the 4th of his career, as a matter of fact, after Dom Capers, Mike Pettin, and Joe Barry. Now he gets to play with Jeff Hafley. He's got to fit in and be a leader in that locker room as to implementing this new scheme and helping everyone fit in with that as well. Prediction-wise, I think he's actually going to step down from where he was in terms of sacks last year. I predict 6 or fewer. I think 7.5 was a bit of an outlier. But again, sacks are not necessarily indicative of his overall performance. And I think he's still going to be getting pressure on the quarterback. Pressure rate will be at or above 10%. He has never had consecutive years in double digits. I think he does that this year for the first time ever. And then I think he hits double-digit tackles for loss for the first time in his career. Surprisingly, that's something he's never done either. I think he will do that, and I think Devontae Wyatt is going to do that as well. So there's your defensive line group. An interesting group for an interesting season in Green Bay. Are they up to the challenge of implementing this new scheme? I think they are, but that, of course, remains to be seen. In the meantime, that's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. It's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation that you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.